Hello, everyone. Let me get this started. We're going to talk about a number of societies in this lecture, going from, say, the origins of civilization in Mesopotamia through the Persian Empire. So let's get started here. We're looking at a number of civilizations or societies, as we say. I'm going to explain that in a second. Over a long period of time. Notice we're using a time, notice we're going backwards from 3800 to 500. This is BCE. It used to be known as BC before Christ, but we no longer use that designation to avoid any emphasis on a particular religion. So we just say BCE. It kind of follows the same thing. So you'll see BCE before the Common Era until you get to the year 1 when we start the Common Era, CE, and move forward from there. But we've got a ways to go before we get to the Common Era. So we're looking at this whole thing. Beginnings of history, beginnings of civilization. Societies have been around a while. Societies are just organized groups of people, could be tribes, bands of people. We had a time period known as the Old Stone Age of hunters and gatherers, that time period. Those were societies. And today we try to call groups of people societies rather than refer to them as sort of parts of a specific civilization. Civilization typically refers to a more advanced stage of human organization. The existence of cities. Cities are essential to civilization. The word civilization comes from the word city. Usually the existence of writing happens within these cities so that kings and rulers can write down law codes, keep track of various records, issue orders for the bureaucracy, maintain holdings or records of their holdings, all those sorts of things. And so that brings us to a particular issue. When does writing begin? And so we're talking about human societies here, civilizations. And we're a bit careful about using the word civilization at times because we think it has a value judgment. That is, if this is a civilization, what about that group over there that doesn't live in a city? Are they uncivilized? I'm not terribly concerned about that, but that's how we are in modern America today. But civilization with cities, it doesn't mean they're more advanced or more moral than anyone else. But we're going to look at various civilizations and societies. Civilization, remember, is sort of an advanced stage. I'm not saying they're more moral. They just have a more complex sort of arrangement and order to their societies, with writing in particular. Writing is not going to be around whenever there's a society. It takes somebody to invent writing. And of course, one of the things about writing, we need to be able to read it, so it has to survive from the past. So it is very much dependent on a society that comes up with these innovations, that creates a writing system to record events, and having that society actually recording those events, writing on something hard like bone. You'll see that in China, or shells, stone, or clay tablets like in Mesopotamia. Because if you're like Egyptians, they develop an early writing system, hieroglyphics, and demonic later on. But if you're just writing on papyrus, which is a reed from the Nile River, that doesn't survive. It doesn't last long. Unlike the pyramids, time puts a hurting on papyrus. It's destroyed. So you need strong, not fragile sources for writing to be preserved and to survive. And we are dependent on writing as historians. We like written sources. We're not archaeologists. We like writing. We want to be able to read. So writing is important. And writing is invented sometime around 3300, 3200, we think, in Mesopotamia. It's going to be cuneiform. And we're going to get to that in a second with the invention of writing. But there you can see cuneiform on a clay tablet. It survives. It gets deciphered, decoded, and we can figure it out. But this notion of civilization, cities are essential to civilization. And as I said, civilizations aren't necessarily more moral, more ethical, better than, say, societies that don't have cities. But we make that judgment that we notice certain things about these civilizations, these cities. The earliest will be city-states in Mesopotamia, independent cities, where we see a political system. We see a ruling class. We see a system of laws, the legal system, a bureaucracy, control over society by using violence, a monopoly on violence by the government and by political leaders, and the right to tax people. So that's civilization. That's a little more advanced stage of society. that we see. We see the existence of social hierarchies within these cities. Now, you do have distinctions within various societies, but you see a ruling class, a noble class at the top, maybe kings, nobles, a priestly class as well at the top of society. Below them will be commoners. Below them will be slaves or various other groups of people. A privileged class at the top, these social hierarchies. We tend to refer to that, and you may have heard me say class. Class refers to income for us in America today. I should say social groups, because although the rich dominated the upper classes, it's based on birth. You're born into particular families. And we just think over time, some families took power, maybe some powerful warriors seized power in an area, appointed themselves ruler, imposed their rule on others. Their family became important. Their families allied with others, and they became this sort of leadership class. And because religion is important for people, it's something that is constant throughout society, a priestly class emerged. Sometimes it was the priestly class that led to leadership of some cities. But the priests were very important. And a big part of this, the development of this society, is writing and laws. You write down laws, you have a system of writing to help control people. And one of the things we see, and to bring order to society, and one of the things we see with the cities popping up, they pop up from some village communities called Neolithic villages, New Stone Age villages, cities popping up in river valleys. Why river valleys? You need a water source. You need to grow your own food. People settle down, they settled into villages, and some of these villages end up becoming cities, although cities also develop on their own. But you want to be near a water source. So it's in these river valleys, like Mesopotamia, which means between the rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates in modern day Iraq, or the Indus River Valley in India. We'll talk about that a little later. But let's talk about Mesopotamia, the Tigris and Euphrates. Those are the two rivers where civilization, where history begins, where writing begins. It's in modern day Iraq, so much of it's desert, but these rivers supply water, and you can organize society. Rulers can organize society to engage in irrigation projects to extend the amount of farmland. And that's what we think is a big part of organizing these cities, the need to get a bunch of people to develop and maintain these irrigation systems so that people can survive by farming. That's basically how we survive today. We grow our own food. Sure, we like to hunt. Mostly that's for pleasure or something to fish, but we survive by growing our own food. We domesticate plants, and we have domesticated animals as well. So those irrigation systems are important. Priests typically are in charge of these irrigation systems as well, not just kings. Priests are very important. We'll look at priests particular because in the ancient world, you tend to have polytheistic religions with gods and goddesses associated with nature. So you pray or you make a sacrifice to a particular god so that it rains, or so that a drought ends, so that you don't have a drought, so that the soil is fertile. That's really what you want. And in Mesopotamia, they build these elaborate sort of temple complexes known as ziggurats, these temples of worship, where at the top is an altar to a god where you make sacrifices. So here's what we're talking about. The Middle East is over here, also called the Near East. We can see Egypt here. You've probably heard of that. Anatolia, that's modern day Turkey right there, Anatolia. Here's Mesopotamia, the Euphrates and the Tigris, from the mountains down into over here into the Persian Gulf. You may have heard of some of these places right here. So here's Mesopotamia, and we're looking at a particular part of Mesopotamia over here, southern Mesopotamia, Sumer, should be easy to remember. Southern Mesopotamia, Sumer, yes, there. And this is where you see the early city-states emerge, like Uruk, Ur, Lagesh. Those are some of the early city-states. But we'll talk about some of these other places a little later. Akkad, Akkadians, Assyrians. We'll see the Persians emerge over here. We'll talk about those a little later in this lecture. So southern Mesopotamia, that's where the first city-states emerge. And that's where you begin to see these kings taking over city-states. And what I keep saying, city-states, these are independent. They're like their own country. So it's not like Uruk and Ur are allied together. They're enemies, they're opponents. They sometimes fight each other. So you have kings in charge of each of these cities. They tend to have some sort of theocratic kingship. The kings are associated with the gods. They work with the priests. And this is where you have those different social groups emerging. At the top, royalty, aristocrats or patricians or nobles, they're sometimes called, a priestly class. It's very, very important. And then all sorts of other people like commoners and slaves. Slaves are typically people captured in battle and warfare. And warfare is common throughout history. It's not something that just happens today. Happened more in the past, actually. So anyways, you have kings and nobles at the top and slaves in society. These are patriarchal societies. What's the role of women? Elite women, noble women, aristocratic women have more benefits and privileges than others, more opportunities than others. They're wealthier than others, but it's a male-dominated society, and women have really few rights. Again, when we look at women's rights throughout history, we'll notice a few things, but it's not until the modern age, and really not even everywhere in the modern age, of course, where women begin to have some semblance of, or at least the idea that women should have equal rights to men. And that idea actually put into practice and enshrined in legal codes and in cultural practices. So anyway, that's society. Why is Mesopotamia important, or why is Sumer important? Because there are a number of firsts. Writing is invented there. So when we say writing is invented, history, a basic definition of history is the story of the written record of humanity. Written records. We rely on written records. So we have to have a system of writing. It's first appears, it's called cuneiform. It's put on clay tablets, so it survives. Some of this stuff survives. They make wedge-shaped imprints with a stylus that they imprint on the clay and harden it, soft clay, and harden it, and that's how you get writing. So we say history began there because the first writing began there. Did anything go on before writing was invented? Of course, people lived. There were other societies that happened. That's prehistory. Prehistoric times, before writing. Very, very complicated system. It emerged from a system, for the most part, known as pictographs. Pictographs, you should know what a pictograph is. The picture represents the word. So if you have a picture of a house, that's the word for house, and kind of interesting, not terribly complicated, but it's very difficult with a pictographic system to express abstract thoughts. What's the picture for envy, for instance? We don't have that. There's nothing clear. So over time, what you see are these pictographs change and they get modified. The symbol sort of breaks off from the original image, and a sound is attached to that symbol, and it becomes a phonetic system of writing. Phonics, phonetics, where the symbol represents a sound so you can spell out the words. Now, cuneiform is unbelievably complicated, hundreds of characters at one point. It takes years of schooling, years of education to become a scribe, a master of cuneiform. And you're a privileged member of society, which tells you the first schools were invented in Sumer. So history began there, the first schools, basically to teach people how to read and write cuneiform. Somebody had to invent the wheel. The Sumerians did it. Somebody had to invent the plow. The Sumerians did it. Somebody had to invent time. Okay, you don't invent time, you just record time. It's the Sumerians who do these sorts of things. That is, they have a numerical system, not just based on units of 10, but units of 60. 60 minutes in an hour, 60 seconds in a minute. And so that's where we get time recorded, and we simply adopt that today. The Sumerians also divided each day into two 12-hour periods. So in effect, they had a 24-hour day, which we accept today. And so our notion of time comes from the Sumerians. Sumerians are also great builders. Those ziggurats, I'm going to show you a picture of one or two actually in a second, took a lot of mathematical skill and ability. So the Sumerians mastered aspects of geometry and trigonometry, all those horrible things that we historians don't like, even though I taught those 1 year in high school. But oh well, that stuff's, you don't stick letters and numbers together, right? That doesn't make sense to me. Anyway, that's a joke, by the way. Here you can see sort of how a pictographic system emerges into cuneiform with a sign. The star, the picture of a star, that's a star, ideogram, and then it merges into a particular sign. It changes, it's modified. You have a variation, and there it is. We'll see that later on with the Greek alphabet and some others. Look at Akkadian cuneiform. I hadn't talked about the Akkadians yet, but that's a pretty cool thing. Maybe a nice tattoo of that, right? Anyway, so here we are, Sumer. I mentioned Akkad just now. Mesopotamia here. Over here is into the Middle East. You can see Phoenicia. We're going to talk about that. Palestine. The Hebrews are going to move into here and establish the Hebrew kingdom. You may have heard of Jericho. And Egypt over here along the Nile River, the gift of the Nile, Egypt. As I said, we look at ancient civilizations. They're very polytheistic, lots of gods and goddesses, often hundreds sometimes. So lots of gods and goddesses. They reflect the cultural aspects of these societies that create these religions. We call them mythologies today, myths. And in Mesopotamia, what you have is a harsh environment. So the gods and goddesses themselves are harsh. They regularly come down and smack the hell out of people, cause all kinds of problems, kill people. They're like the gods and goddesses of the Mesopotamian religion, Mesopotamian pantheon, are sort of exaggerated human beings, except incredibly emotional human beings, impetuous. They like to get drunk. They cause all kinds of trouble. They just terrorize people all the time. People were made, according to invented, I should say, people were created according to Mesopotamian religion in order to please the gods, to work for the gods. The god needed workers, so they created people. That's how it works. Is that a moral religion? Not really. And there's this concept of an afterlife, but only the gods and goddesses are immortal. Only the gods and goddesses have everlasting life, not people. As I said, they're associated with nature, and you make sacrifices so that, you know, the storms come to an end or it rains or something like that. But these are brutal, vindictive gods and goddesses in the Mesopotamian pantheon because they reflect aspects of the culture, the environment that Mesopotamians live in. It's a hard and difficult life. So as I say, is there any sort of ethical dimension? Not really with this religion. People just die and they go to this land of dust or land of no return. But you have to appease these gods. You make sacrifices. And there's a recreation of a ziggurat right here, the temple complex, steps all the way to the top, where there will be an altar at the top to make your sacrifices. This is at the center of these Sumerian cities. Very important complex. And there you can see from the Iraq War, which was a couple of decades ago, almost a couple of decades ago, one of our pilots is flying over a ziggurat in modern day Iraq. One of the other firsts for the Mesopotamians is an epic. You may have heard of the Iliad and the Odyssey from the Greeks, but an epic, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is about this legendary king of Uruk, who was half man and half god. They had a situation going on between a god and a human being, and ask your advisor what happened, but it produced Gilgamesh, who was part god and mostly human though. And he's an amazing figure. He's better at everything than every other human being, but he's not quite a god. And one of the things that happens, he finds out that he's going to be immortal, and he goes on this quest for immortality. He has all these wonderful adventures. I highly recommend that you read it. It's absolutely great. Has a friend in the wild called Enkidu, who runs with the animals, lives with all the animals, talks to them, and Gilgamesh decides, I'm going to tame this guy. Sends him a prostitute there. He spends about a week with Enkidu, or she spends about a week with Enkidu, and Enkidu is tamed and wants to come live in the city and leave the animals alone. Figure that out on your own. Maybe women civilize men. Maybe that's part of the meaning of that. But Enkidu is going to die. Enkidu, before he dies, tells Gilgamesh that, hey, this is what happens to us. We would just die. And Gilgamesh goes on this quest to gain immortality. He never does. There is a flood story, by the way, where one of the gods gets mad at people because we're just making noise on earth, going about our daily affairs. And so he causes a great flood, and it rains for about a week, not 40 days, rains for a week and kills everything. But there were two people who decided to get two of all these animals, build a boat, put them on there, and ride out the storm, ride out the rain. And so Gilgamesh goes to meet the sort of Babylonian, Mesopotamian Noah and Mrs. Noah. And they tell him about a plant at the bottom of the sea. And if he goes and gets this plant and plants it and eats it, and it'll restore your youth. So he gets the plant, goes to the bottom of the sea, comes out with the plant, and decides to take a nap. He's too tired. He's worn out. So right on the bank, he just takes a nap. A snake comes along and eats the plant. So no everlasting life, that is, no rebirth, at least restoration of youth, even for Gilgamesh. And the snake is this symbol of evil. And it also explains why snakes shed their skin. So when you look at an epic, it is designed kind of like an encyclopedia, I guess Wikipedia we call it today. It is designed to explain certain things to people in those societies. Explain the reality as they perceive it to people within those societies. So you might say, why, if some little kid asks, well, why does a snake shed its skin? And they may say, well, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, remember the snake ate that plant that restores your youth. There's no knowledge of herpetology at that time, so that's good enough for them. And basically Gilgamesh wanders back all despondent about not gaining immortality, and he's going to die. But see, people celebrate his existence. And look at this great man. He built the walls of this city. He did all these amazing things. And what this story is designed to teach people is to live life now, embrace life now, cherish your family, your kids, enjoy good food, all of that stuff. That's the message of this. So it's going to be a bit different when we talk about the Egyptians, but that's Mesopotamian religion. Now, one of the things going on with Sumer is it's going to be conquered. In fact, Mesopotamia has a number of conquerors throughout its existence. Lots and lots of civilizations and societies come in and conquer. There's a group from the north known as Akkadians. They move in, take over Sumer. For the most part, these Sumerian cities were fighting each other. They weakened each other through warfare. So Sargon of Akkad comes in and conquers Sumer and unites this region, creates a kingdom, and adopts Sumerian culture. Today we might say, oh my God, that's cultural appropriation. That's pretty much how the world works. Sumer was more advanced. I showed you an image earlier about Akkadian cuneiform. They adopt the script that the Sumerians created. So that's what sort of makes this important. It spreads culture out of Sumer. Later on, you have other conquerors who come in, some Babylonians, old Babylonians. One of them is a guy by the name of Hammurabi. What's most important about Hammurabi is that, yes, he uses religion, his god Marduk, to establish his rule over others. He's a good diplomat. One of the things that's most important about him, and really what's most important, is the law code that's associated with one of the earliest versions of a legal system in place that survives, the Code of Hammurabi, which has a list of laws and actual rulings according to that legal system. One of the things legal systems do is they tell us things about that particular society. And you can see in this Code of Hammurabi, there's no equality under the law, which is sort of what we have today, at least theoretically what we have today. We have punishment for all sorts of crimes according to the Code of Hammurabi, but you're punished based on your social status within that society. You may be familiar with some of these things. These are actual laws from the Code of Hammurabi. If a man put out the eye of another man, his eye shall be put out. If a man knock out the teeth of his equal, his teeth shall be knocked out. If he put out the eye of a freedman, a commoner, he shall pay 1 gold mina. Basically, what's going on here is it's this man you want to think of as an aristocrat, a noble, knocks out the eye of another nobleman, he loses an eye. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, if you are social equals. If a noble knocks out the eye or the tooth of a commoner, they just pay a fine. So punishment fits the crime only when you are dealing with social equals. Excuse me. The aristocrats, the patricians, the nobles, the upper classes have it better under this Code of Hammurabi. And there are all kinds of things. Bartenders who water down drinks get drowned. So they're kind of consumer protections. You want to have a drink? Yeah, enjoy a drink. Don't let a bartender water it down. That is, there's some things in here. We say it promotes the welfare of people, regulates business activity, commercial activity, deals with property, agriculture. These might not seem like fair laws today, but we're talking about centuries and centuries and centuries ago. It's very hard to have current morals, our current moral attitudes about things. It's very hard, I should say, I'm having difficult saying this, it's very hard to use our current morals to try to understand societies way, way back in the past, even for just not that long ago, because our ethics and morals have changed very quickly in the modern age. But notice this: if any man is committing a robbery and is caught committing a robbery, he shall be put to death. So you're protecting people. And there's an image of the Code of Hammurabi right there. That's what makes Hammurabi so important. So let's begin to look at some other places as well. You can see the Hittites. These are Indo-Europeans. Indo-European, the word Europe comes from that. It refers to languages. That is the Hittites, who were in modern day Turkey and Anatolia. Where's my little pointer here? They spoke a language that is related to languages we later know of as European languages, German, French, English, all that stuff. Now, vastly different, of course, it's the ancient world, but there's some connections. Linguists will show us that. Over here, we have some societies that emerge, in particular Phoenicia. We're going to talk about that. And then let's talk about this place, the gift of the Nile River. Egypt, that is the gift of the Nile, led by pharaohs. Not always. You had kings in charge at some time, but an old civilization. Most of what we're talking about is the time of the pharaohs, these divine kings, these gods who were placed among the pantheon, but also on earth as well. You know, it's an old civilization. The longest lasting of these ancient civilizations is Egyptian civilization. Dates back way back when, until we begin to see sometime around here when Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt are united. We're not exactly sure under this mythical King Menes or King Narmer. We're not exactly sure, but it's a long period of history. What's important here is this item, the Rosetta Stone, which you can see in the British Museum in London. It was taken by Napoleon's troops when Napoleon invaded Egypt, and then the Brits beat Napoleon at war and took it. And later somebody by the name of Jean-Francois Champollion looked at this and said, I'm going to figure out what it says. You've got three different systems. You've got hieroglyphics, you've got Demotic, and you've got ancient Greek. Lots of people knew ancient Greek. They didn't know these two other languages, but it was pretty obvious that these things said the same thing, but in three different languages. So this young Frenchman works at it for a long time and figures it out. Notice what we're talking about. This goes way back to the ancient world. It's found just a few centuries ago. It's got these three languages. It's decoded, figured out as a phonetic language as well. Later on in 1822, it's interesting. This little Frenchman taught the Egyptians how to read their ancient languages. You know, so it's a very important item. The Rosetta Stone, which is used by some language company today, Rosetta Stone. So it's a very important document. It helps us read ancient Egyptian. And there's that cool little priestly carvings, that script, that writing, hieroglyphics. It's phonetic as well, but you can see the picture. They liked having that picture there. It's kind of cool to look at. Egyptians, as I said, it's a long-lasting civilization. So we divide it into periods known as kingdoms, Old, Middle, and New Kingdom, with intermediate periods in between those times. And there are different stages in Egyptian civilization during this time period. Unlike Mesopotamia, where you have lots and lots of conquerors, you really don't have that in Egypt. You have a long period of unity. Later on, you'll have those conquerors. You know, we talk about Alexander and the Greeks and Macedonians, and later the Romans. We'll get to that. But Egypt is fairly peaceful. It's fairly prosperous. The Nile is a fertile river. You can see it floods annually, regularly, and deposits rich nutrients into the soil. So the Egyptians have a much greater diet than the Mesopotamians. More to eat, more pleasant society. Egyptian religion is a lot more pleasant than that Mesopotamian religion. It's a reflection of that particular culture there. But when we look at the Old Kingdom, this is a time when the pyramids were built. The first one is a step pyramid designed by Imhotep for Zoser, the pharaoh, the step pyramid. There's a picture of the step pyramid. It's also a time period when you have other pyramids built where the pharaohs are going to be buried somewhere around there, near there in the pyramid. Because what the pharaohs are, they're the divine kings. They are gods. And they have a soul, the concept of a soul or spiritual essence. It's easier to call it soul because we understand that a little better, which passes back and forth between the afterlife and the present life. So you mummify the body, you have the pharaoh buried with everything he might need or used in this world, and because that soul's going to travel back and forth and he's going to need all that stuff, even some servants at times. The biggest, the largest of the pyramids, almost 500 feet tall. That's the Great Pyramid. Really massive structure where thousands and thousands of commoners would work and build these pyramids for their god kings. That's a lot of work. Egyptian religion, as I said, it's a lot more pleasant. It's going to change. Initially during the Old Kingdom, only the pharaohs gained access to the afterlife. That's going to change when more Egyptians do. Interesting gods and goddesses evolved. Osiris, Isis, Seth. Osiris is associated with the Nile. He supposedly led a human life, died, and was reborn And it's associated with the rise and fall of the Nile River, a god of fertility as well, and also becomes a judger of souls, of everyone's soul. You need to lead a good life. You judge your soul, your ka, and you also need to perform certain rituals. So leading a good life and certain rituals that are going to have to be performed. But Osiris is the judger of souls, gets you into the afterlife. And as I said, some of this I already talked about. Egyptian religion is very polytheistic, typical of other ancient civilizations, lots of gods and goddesses involved. It's a book of the dead to help give us some ideas about what the Egyptians thought about death and the afterlife and life itself, and how to gain access to the afterlife. But some of this I've already discussed, including hieroglyphics. And you can read some of these other things about the importance of Egyptian society, the value they placed on family and marriage, in particular to have sons. While you may say that Egyptian women enjoyed a few more privileges than Mesopotamian women, it's still very much a patriarchal society as we would judge it today. That's pretty typical throughout history and even common around the world today, as I said. Now, the Old Kingdom is going to come to an end. We're not exactly sure why, but the Egyptian society under Egyptians no longer recognize one pharaoh. It breaks apart. You have decentralized rule and intermediate period. And then finally one pharaoh takes over, and I'm going to limit the number of pharaohs you have to know. One pharaoh takes over, and that ushers in the Middle Kingdom. Middle Kingdom is a time when you see more prosperity, particularly for a rising middle class. It's also a time period when religion changes. That's when Osiris becomes the judger of souls. It's not just the pharaoh who has access to the afterlife. It's all Egyptians who can do this, become immortal, unlike Mesopotamia. But you have to lead a good life. You have to lead a moral life. Let's engage in certain rituals to appease the gods as well. Middle Kingdom is going to come to an end when the first foreign invaders, successful foreign invaders of Egypt, take over, the Hyksos. The Hyksos are Semites. I mentioned Indo-European earlier. Indo-European refers to language. Semite refers to language. Semitic peoples, it's Semitic languages. The Hebrews might be the most famous, but notice we're identifying some people based on the language they speak. Semites. Hyksos and Semites are related. All Semites are related. Arabic is a Semitic language. So theoretically, Arabs and Jews, the Hebrews, ancient Hebrews, are related by language, Semite. And so the Hyksos, this is a time when the Jews wander into Egypt as well. They're later going to be enslaved, but not by the Hyksos. So the Hyksos are in charge. They're just more advanced. One of the things, if we get back to maybe a map I had, the banks of the Nile, Egyptian society was along the banks of the Nile. Only a few miles on each side of the Nile River would you find Egyptian society. Why? It's desert. So it's protected by desert, much like America was protected by two oceans from invasion before we had modern technology and missiles and all that, ICBMs and all that stuff, and submarines. Egypt was protected by desert. So the Hyksos are the first successful invaders of Egypt. They introduced bronze into Egyptian society. They used bronze weapons. They used chariots. Ultimately, they're going to be overthrown by a ruler who sets himself up as pharaoh. Hyksos are going to be expelled or enslaved along with the Hebrews. And it ushers in a new period in Egyptian society. So we went from the Old Kingdom, pyramids, Middle Kingdom, democratization of the afterlife. And then the Hyksos took over, and now we're in the New Kingdom. And this is when Egypt becomes an empire. Egypt is no longer just along the banks of the Nile. You have a series of warrior pharaohs, as I say here. Egypt becomes imperialistic. They go on the war path. They fight, they conquer, they take over other lands like Syria and Palestine. So they expand the boundaries of Egypt beyond the Nile River. That's imperialism. They establish an empire. Okay, just change the I to an E. That's how you get empire. So those pharaohs are military leaders. And this is when you see a massive slave-based society. They build the temples then. But here's Egypt, you can see, moves into the Middle East, goes to war with the Hittite Empire. These Indo-Europeans, where they sort of reach a compromise agreement, a neutrality pact to not fight each other and just govern these areas divided up. But there's the Egyptian Empire. As I said, most of the pharaohs are warrior pharaohs, Ramses and others, almost. But there are a couple of interesting pharaohs there. One is Hatshepsut, who is female. It's interesting, the guy who figured out hieroglyphics was reading it on temple walls and kept wondering why a sort of feminine pronoun, feminine article, and why they had so many feminine words that were associated with this particular pharaoh, Hatshepsut. He didn't figure it out. Later on, we figured out Hatshepsut was actually a woman, and it was very rare to have a female pharaoh of Egypt. Another one is Akhenaten, who introduces some religious changes, more monotheism, trying to replace this sort of this pantheon of Egyptian gods and goddesses with one, him, he's a god. You can see his name is Akhenaten. It's a change. He changes his name to Akhenaten. The last part, the last four words are the god. Remember, Egyptian pharaohs are gods. He's the representative on earth of the god Aten, who he wants everyone to worship. So get rid of all those other gods. Get rid of Osiris. Remember, Osiris was the one who judges your soul. He tries to introduce this religious change. It's a radical change. People don't like their religion being tampered with. They're worried about whether their soul will be saved. And so it's going to be rejected. It doesn't last, but it's kind of interesting how you begin to see, particularly in Western civilization, we're going to see a move towards monotheism. The other group I mentioned, the Indo-Europeans, those are the rivals, the Hittites. They're an interesting kind of group of people, but they're going to disappear from history. We'll see when they're attacked by the Sea Peoples. The Hittites, there's sort of an image of Hittites. And the Sea Peoples are one of these groups, are actually a number of different groups who take to the sea. They attack the Hittite kingdom. They attack the Egyptian New Kingdom. They sail throughout the Mediterranean, and they attack these areas. This is where the Hittites would be, and here's the Egyptians right here, and they attack in this area and set up their own kingdoms, set up their own territories. The Sea Peoples, they're a bunch of different groups, but they attack and they destroy these empires. The Hittites disappear from history. The Egyptians return to the banks of the Nile, never to have this massive empire again, and they'll be conquered later on by Alexander and the Romans. So you have this power vacuum emerging in that part of the world, and it allows these smaller kingdoms to emerge. One of the most important is the Phoenicians, the good seafarers. They establish a number of cities. Known for their textiles and their blue color. But what's the most important about the Phoenicians is an alphabet, a simplified alphabet, all consonants, less than 24 letters, 22 letters, all consonants. Hebrew's all consonant today, only consonants today. You can infer the vowel sound from that. A phonetic, simplified version of the alphabet where one symbol, as I said, less than 24, can represent a sound. It makes learning to read and write, becoming literate, a lot easier. The phonetic alphabet. So you think of the Phoenicians, phonics, phonetics, it's their alphabet that's the gift to the world. And so you can see some of these things here, different alphabets where you go to the Phoenician. The Greek is going to be important to us as well when we talk about the Greeks. And our Roman alphabet today, you can see how it evolves. A simple version, right? We teach little kids, I don't know, Big Bird or somebody on Sesame Street teaches kids the letters of the alphabets, right? It's a lot easier. Could you imagine trying to teach Akkadian cuneiform? That would be a problem. And you can see the Phoenicians sail around, establish settlements, one of which would be Carthage that we'll get to later because they are a rival to the Romans, but that's a little later. Another group, they're not Sea Peoples, they're not terribly important, and they wouldn't be terribly important except for one thing, their religion. The religion. These are the Hebrews, the ancient Jews, the Hebrews. It's a religion of the patriarchs with these great male leader figures, Abraham, Isaac, Joseph, Moses. Their history is recorded in the Old Testament, what the Christians call Old Testament, and the first 5 books the Jews referred to as the Torah, starting with Genesis, right? There you can read about the wanderings of the Hebrew people. They are a wandering people, these nomads and sheep herders who originate within Mesopotamia and wander out. They make their way to Egypt. They're accepted by the Hyksos, then they're going to be enslaved. But the concept that's important with the Hebrews is this covenant with God. Yahweh is God. And you look at that first of the 10 commandments, first commandments, thou shalt have no gods before me. It doesn't initially mean that the Hebrews only were true monotheists. Initially, when you look at the Hebrews, they believed God was their God. God chose Abraham. They were a chosen people. God chose them. You follow Yahweh, you'll be taken care of. You don't, bad stuff's going to happen to you. That's basically the Old Testament. You got to follow Yahweh. You got to maintain that covenant with God. But notice it says, don't acknowledge other gods before me. Don't put any gods before me. That those gods are for other people. I am your God. I chose you. You follow me. These are going to be my rules. Obey them, and you'll be good. When we look at early Hebrew civilization, we see that they're organized into 12 tribes. It's the book of Judges, different groups. Moses leads them out of slavery in Egypt supposedly to go to Canaan, where the Canaanites live. And they're going to subdue the Canaanites. Moses actually doesn't make it, but they ultimately subdue the Canaanites. But they meet another group, a group of sea people known as the Philistines. And so this organized group of tribes organizes under a king. The first Hebrew king is King Saul to fight the Philistines. He's not all that successful against these Philistine warriors. He's overshadowed by this young Hebrew named David. You may have heard of David and Bathsheba. Doesn't always behave properly, but he's a great warrior. He wanted to marry Saul's daughter, and something about he had to bring back 200 foreskins of the Philistines. Ask your advisor with that. That's a hell of a thing for a father just to demand of somebody who wants his daughter's hand in marriage, right? Thinks he's going to die fighting the Philistines, but he can kill some Philistines, not just David. And he takes over when Saul dies. He defeats the Philistines, builds this Hebrew capital known as Jerusalem. This is where we get Jerusalem, the Hebrew kingdom with Jerusalem as the capital. Not necessarily the most popular figure. He's going to be replaced by King Solomon, who builds this symbol of Hebrew unity, the great Hebrew temple, which houses the Ark of the Covenant, the sacred chest that contains the 10 Commandments. That's in the Hebrew Hebrew temple. It's a symbol of unity. If you know anything about history, you know that the temple's been destroyed a couple of times. All that remains is what's called the Western Wall. It used to be called the Wailing Wall. It's called the Western Wall. Solomon himself wasn't all that popular, supposedly known for his wisdom. You may know that story as well. Actually had a number of wives and concubines as well. King Solomon, when he dies, the kingdom splits in two. So no sooner do they get organized under a king, they defeat the Philistines, build Jerusalem, build a Hebrew kingdom, build the temple, they split again. The Hebrews split again. Israel in the north is a kingdom and Judah in the south. And what happens here? Well, you can look over this slide. What happens here? You can see these two kingdoms here, Samaria, Jerusalem, those capitals. What happens here? They get destroyed. The Hebrews get conquered. Israel first, that northern kingdom, by the Assyrians, an unbelievable, brutal people. This is where we have the story of the 10 lost tribes, what happened to them. And then Judah is going to survive until 586, where the temple is destroyed by the Chaldeans. These new Babylonians destroy the Hebrew temple. They'll later rebuild, but it's destroyed. It ushers into Babylonian captivity of the Jews when the Jews are enslaved in the Babylonian Empire. Until they're freed by Cyrus the Great of Persia. We'll talk about in a second. What's important to the Hebrews? Family is important. Having a family and having children, in particular sons. That's very important. You have a religious duty to get married and have a family and have children, and to learn and read the sacred texts of your religion and practice that, maintain that covenant with Yahweh. Because as you can see, when supposedly the Hebrews break that covenant with Yahweh, they don't recognize Yahweh, they start recognizing other gods, they misbehave, they get annihilated, and they are conquered and destroyed, right? That sort of thing. And what you begin to see during this time period, the Babylonian captivity, an interesting thing occurs. It transforms Egyptian Hebrew religion and makes it more monotheistic. Prophets come along. You probably heard of prophets like Jeremiah, Isaiah, all these prophets come along who try to understand Judaism and the role of Jews under foreign domination. How can Jews survive? How can this religion survive? And what you begin to see is a number of these prophets point to Yahweh as a God of justice and righteousness. So expanding this notion of covenant, a God of justice. He doesn't cause evil, people do. And what Yahweh demands, according to the prophets, is good ethical behavior. There's the covenant with God, but there's good ethical behavior, virtuous behavior that's essential for being Jewish. Don't oppress the poor. Take care of those who are suffering. Seek justice. And one of the things that happens if you look at, say, say, the book of Leviticus with all the emphasis on rituals. The prophets emphasize that Judaism is less about ritual and more about virtue and ethics and behavior and following the covenant that way. But as I said, one of the groups that destroys the Hebrews, the Northern Kingdom, were the Assyrians, one of the most brutal people in the ancient world. Most people in the ancient world were brutal. How do you conquer a territory without being brutal? Feather dusters or something? That's not going to happen. You're brutal. And the Assyrians are unbelievably brutal, probably the dominant military for a couple of centuries. It was their god. If we look at this empire, here are the Assyrians right here, carve out the largest empire around at that time. It was their god Assur who demanded holy war. You go out and kill and conquer and destroy, and you leave the bodies of your dead all over the place so that the people know who is in charge now. The Assyrians are in charge. It's interesting, their artwork is reflective of this incredible brutality. They'd like to flay people. Flaying means peeling off their skin very much while they are alive. So they're unbelievably brutal. And that brutality, of course, they regularly terrorize their subjects. They would reinvade parts of their empire and kill people, not just demand taxes and tribute, but they'd regularly invade and kill people in their own empire. It bred a lot of hatred, and finally they're going to be overthrown. It's the ancient world, that's what happens. A group of Chaldeans who themselves are going to be overthrown by this group of people. The Persians, already talked about Iraq, Tigris and Euphrates. The Persians, this is modern day Iran. Up until the modern age, it was known as Persia. The Persian Empire, you can see this is the largest empire to date. Way over here, Bactria in Afghanistan, all the way to Egypt. The Persian Empire is kind of interesting. Syrians had a major empire. It's dwarfed by this Persian Empire. Founded by Cyrus the Persian, Cyrus the Great, Cyrus the Persian. Very interesting guy. You have to go out and conquer and dominate, control. But he was someone who allowed people to practice their own culture, their own religion, as long as they played by the rules, as long as they followed the laws, served in the military, paid taxes. He left you alone. Don't cause trouble. So unusual for his time period, he tolerated a lot of the different subject peoples and the variety of cultures they had. This is a time period, if we go back and look at this, where am I? The Babylonian captivity. It's Cyrus the Great who ends the Babylonian captivity of the Jews, that time period. We talked about the importance of the prophets, and allows Jews to return back to their homeland, rebuild the temple, rebuild that Hebrew kingdom, well, not the kingdom there, but rebuild the temple and practice their faith. That is, he tolerated his subject peoples to an incredible degree. These are Indo-Europeans. Iranians are Indo-Europeans today. It makes them sort of interesting in that part of the world. That is, Persian language is a language that is Indo-European. One of the interesting things that develops in there, the Persian religion, like others of the ancient world, is polytheistic, but a new religion is going to emerge. Zoroastrianism. A prophet Zoroaster emerges out of this and talks about and preaches a new religion which later Persian emperors are going to adopt. And if Persian emperors continue to adopt this faith, it becomes the dominant faith of that empire. It's very influential on other religions, and we'll look at that a little later. Even it spreads into Western Europe, and you still have a few Zoroastrians around today. Not that many. There were a few. I don't know if I'm sure, I hope you've heard of Freddie Mercury of Queen, the late Freddie Mercury, one of the great singers and frontman for a rock band. He was Zoroastrian, by the way. I don't know how dedicated he was to it, but he at least acknowledged being Zoroastrian. What this religion does is that it's a dualistic religion, a good God and a bad God. A good God and a bad God who are fighting it out for control over humanity. They're fighting out for the control of the world. And what it is an ethical religion. The good God demands that you be a good, virtuous person. Take care of those suffering. Love your fellow man, this brotherhood of mankind, sisterhood of mankind. Or it's a patriarchal society. Let's not get too far with women's equality at that time, but be a good person, because there is an afterlife. There is a day of judgment that is going to occur when you are going to be judged based on your deeds in life. You may say that you were a good person, but if you did a bunch of bad things, you're going to hell, essentially. You have already sided with this God, the bad God here, against the good God by your very behavior, not by what you say you do, by your very behavior. So it's this concept of a day of judgment where your everlasting fate, your immortality that is everlasting, is going to be determined. And you want to get to the good place, heaven, as opposed to the bad place, hell. So that makes that an interesting religion in the Persian Empire. And we will stop right there.